I think Andrew's pretty well known, but let me just run through the biography that I have. He was elected for the federal seat of Goldstein in Victoria in October 2004, and he's held positions as chairman of the government's Workplace Relations Task Force, parliamentary secretary to the Minister for Immigration and Multicultural Affairs, and Minister for Vocational and Further Education in the last government. Although, I suppose the last government was the Gillard government. Anyway, whatever. In opposition, Andrew has held positions as Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs and Shadow Minister for Infrastructure and Climate Change. He's now the Chairman of the Coalition Policy Development Committee and Shadow Minister for Finance, Deregulation and Debt Reduction. Debt reduction, I like that one. His qualifications in agricultural science and a first-class honours degree in economics. You probably didn't know, Andrew, that my first attempt at university was in agricultural science, but that didn't go very far. In the 70s, he worked as an animal health officer and then as an agricultural economist. In the 80s, he was the Executive Director of the Cattle Council of Australia and later Executive Director of the National Farmers Federation. From 1990 to 97, he was the Federal Director and Campaign Director of the Liberal Party. From 1997 to 2004, Andrew worked for Kerry and James Packer, as well as advising major companies around Australia and overseas. During this time, he also built an Australia-wide direct marketing technology company, was on the investment team for the Gorgon gas project, and was a board member of Sinclair Knight Merz. He's a board member of the Garvan Medical Research Foundation, the Menzies Research Centre, the Big Brother Big Sister Mentoring Organisation, a member of the YWCA Leadership Group, and was Honorary Treasurer of the Liberal Party in New South Wales. In 2003, he was awarded the Office of the Order. He was awarded as an Officer of the Order of Australia for his service to agriculture, politics, and the community. Andrew Robb, thank you.
Thanks very much, Greg, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Please keep eating. I don't want to cause any indigestion by bringing the program forward a little bit this afternoon. I'm sorry about that because I've got to catch an airplane and have another commitment back in Melbourne. Thanks for the opportunity here today. The topic I think you might have seen from the material that went out was that philosophy matters, and in that context I would like to talk about the approach we've taken to policy formation if we do get the privilege of government. I'm not going to talk about politics. If in Q&A you want to get into how we deal with a celebrity, I'm happy to talk about that. I think we're still in a very strong position, but we've got work to do, and I just am relishing the opportunity of government if we get it, because there's so much to be done. The reason I chose this topic is because it really has framed, the experience of the last few years has framed the approach we've taken in the last three years in particular to policy making. In 1993, I was the campaign director for the Liberal Party with John Hewson, and you might recall it was the unlosable election, which we duly lost, and that's been something I keep reminding my own colleagues for the last 6 months, that it's nothing's ever certain, and I found that in business. The deal's not done until it's done, and it's no different in politics. But the point about the 93 one is that we lost it in many ways because we played the politics badly, but we had an 800-page suicide note, as some called it subsequently, which was called Fight Back, that many of you would recall. But the thing about Fight Back was it was a body of really well-constructed policy across every area of policy, and it did reflect a set of principles, and there was a consistency across the policy, and there was some depth, and a lot of work had been put into how that would be implemented. And it was the result really of a lot of that philosophical debate that took part in since about 83 until 93 within the party. It was the Peacock-Howard juxtaposition, all of that. A lot of that had roots in the different attitudes to policy. It wasn't so much a personality issue, and it really reflected what was happening in the global community. In the 70s, with the when capital started to move in real time, it forced the freeing up of major economies around the world, such as ours, which had been regulated for decades. And that took 15, 20, 25 years. And that we were in the heart of it then. But the Fight Back document reflected the new age of markets, much more appreciation of markets, giving much more responsibility to individuals, reflecting really the philosophy of the Liberal Party, in my view. The trouble was we had a lot of rough edges, and we lost the election because the politics was badly played. This game really is a question of both politics and policy, and you've got to do both well, I think, to be successful in the long term. Now, John Howard took really Fight Back without the name and all the political rough edges knocked off it. He took that to the 96 election. It was the biggest Liberal win in history, right? And I'd say to you, and my judgment is that the 11 and a half years, he was the second longest serving Prime Minister in our history, and I think a lot of it was due to the fact that he had an agenda. He had policies. And he even when I came back in 2004 and ran for Parliament, I could see him still dipping into Fight Back for his inspiration and his ideas. Right. So I think longevity in government is a function of good policy. And it makes sense. You're only going to politics to take the community from where it is now to somewhere better. And the only way you do that is not through rhetoric and lots of fine objectives, it's through policies. You can win an election on rhetoric and ideas and playing good politics. I'd say to you, Kevin Rudd did that in 2007. The reason he foundered in less than 3 years was because there was no substance. There were 168 reviews called in 2008, and many of those are dust. They're still sitting on the shelves. A lot of that work, and the fact of the matter is that I think Labor have foundered in government because they've never really had done the policy work. They had the research, they knew where people wanted to be, they knew the sorts of things that they were attracted to, education revolutions and all the rest, but there was no substance to it, right? So with that experience, we have made a particular effort, particularly since the last election, the 2010, to get some set of tram tracks, if you like, a set of policies and do the work in a way which reflects the consistency. Because I think with John Howard, because he had this agenda, which was consistent across so many areas of policy, because there were principles that underlay that policy development, people knew where he would jump on issues. There was a measure of certainty in the community. They could see the direction, even if they didn't like. They could loathe him, but they still knew where he would jump on issues, even issues that hadn't been prominent in the last decade. Something new would occur. They still had a sense of where John Howard would move in tackling, in addressing certain issues. And it did introduce a large measure of certainty into the community, especially the business community, but even to households. And I think one of the reasons we've got 10% of households saving 10% of disposable income now, and basically investment on hold and foreign investment very shaky, a lot of that is due to the fact that there's been a minority government in particular. One day, 1 week, the Greens are dominating which way they're going. Next week it's the crossbenchers. The next week it's the unions. Next week it might be Labor itself actually doing something that it particularly wanted. I mean, there's just been no direction. People have felt that the country, they can't get a handle on where the country's going. Where are we taking this country? And so there's this anxiety and great uncertainty. So people are saving like they never have before. Normally 1 or 2% of disposable income. We're up at around 10% now. No wonder retail's, so sick. Investment has been on hold now for a long time. Small business, no profits in small business. They're just holding on. Everyone's waiting for something to change and a new direction to come. All of that experience has influenced the way we've gone about it. After last election, Tony Abbott set up a small group, which I've been chairing. Every colleague has come through past my little committee, sometimes 5 times. It's been an iterative process, and it's been a process. The process is important. You know what it's like, whether in a business or in politics. The bowling club, You just need processes to get things done. It's been another failing of that we've observed, in the government. But we have had a process to start with. But more importantly, we've tried to impose a discipline, a consistency of philosophy across the policy work that we've done. The overarching objective, if you like, that we have kept drumming into everyone who comes into my room for the last 3 years is that if we get the privilege of government, our principal aim is to replace big government, the centrality that big government has realised under this government, and replace it with robust growth of the private sector, right? So we measure all the policy work against whether we can remove big government, both as spending or the intrusiveness of 22,000 new regulations in this term of office. What can we do about replacing this big government? Now, I just say to you that there is a reason why I think we've had such a plethora of big government since the global financial crisis. I think if in our own lives, or with our companies or organisations, or with the country, when there's a crisis, you tend to revert back to the basic principles that you believe in. And you instinctively go back and try and find some sure footing, right? Now, I think the global financial crisis had that effect on governments. And you look around the world, coincidentally, there were a lot of centre-left governments. There were some centre-right, but overwhelmingly, I think it was just a coincidence at the time that there was the centre-left governments, including Obama, including the Rudd government. Now, their instincts, rather than being fiscal conservatives and all the other things that he was going to be, their instincts, they went back to follow their instincts, which was government knows best. Spend our way out of it, control people's lives. People are not in a position to make decisions in a crisis that will best deal with their own circumstance. Government's got to do it. This sort of mindset, which is a philosophical basis, right? That's why I'm saying, for the first time since the Berlin Wall fell, it's annoyed me enormously. So many people have said over the last 20 years, there's not much difference between the two parties. I just say to you, the last 5 years has demonstrated that philosophy matters, right? You look at centre-right government, you look at what John Key's done in New Zealand. They had no resources boom. They were in a worse position fiscally when he'd just taken over, I think, or was just about to, when the global financial crisis occurred. Fiscally, a lot worse position than we are. They'll be back in surplus long before we will. In New Zealand, they've done a whole lot of things. Their stimulus package was, one, a lot less than Australia's, but two, it went to lower costs in business. I can't remember all the procedures, but their whole focus of their stimulus was to remove taxes from businesses temporarily and things like this, to maintain employment by lowering business costs. Quite different to the centre-left approach. And they have continued. They've continued with this. The philosophy has continued, and it's in stark contrast to what we have sought to do. Our side of politics is gives prominence to the individual, to make the most of the God-given talents. Everyone has got particular unique strengths. Now, it's important from our view to give people the responsibility at the opportunity to make the most of those strengths, to choose how they lead their own lives. The only qualification is that they take responsibility for the choices, right? And whereas we've seen there's a firestorm of regulation been going through that place, a conveyor belt of regulations. It has not stopped. A lot of it's been dominated by the unions, but I've been covering through this coordination role every area of policy, and the same problems are occurring in every area. The welter of new regulations to control the decision-making process, in many ways to almost help to be governing or managing businesses from government. This is almost, or certainly from the bureaucracy, right? I mean, their capacity to so inveigle themselves now into the operations of so many areas of business. And it is choking business, it is undermining confidence, and it is fundamentally, I think, holding the country back. I do think the next 30 years we've got spectacular opportunities, but the way we're positioned at the moment, we are not going to realise those. And what we've done with that overarching objective, and we've had 4 principles to try and drive that movement from the centrality of government to trying to put in centre stage the 2.4 million businesses, and to breathe life into, to restore an appetite for risk and investment, right? That's been the objective. And we've had 4 principles. One, to live within our means, right? Now that means we will stop the growth of debt. I keep getting told, you know, there's cheap money out there, which is it, there's trillions of dollars through quantitative easing, sort of accumulating in money markets around the world, looking for a home. I keep being told, well, government, here's the time to borrow and build the infrastructure that we need. Well, our view is it is the time to borrow and build the infrastructure, but we should get private sector doing that borrowing. How do we encourage the private sector to invest in public infrastructure? Then there are lots of opportunities. Once you've got that mindset, colleagues have been coming to me now for 3 years. They've got, you know, social or economic infrastructure projects, 3 billion here, 4 billion. I say, get on your bike, go back out. We won't have the money. If we get to government, we won't have the money. We're not going to increase the debt. We've got to start to stop this growth of debt. The growth of debt is now at the greatest growth of debt we've had in our history. And when you add up federal, state and quasi-government agencies, the exposure and all the things that are off budget, 11% now GDP, debt to GDP from the feds, 11% from the state. That was 0 for both 5 years ago. If you add all the semi-government agencies, you're getting close to 35, somewhere between 35 and 40% of debt to GDP. If you look out in the next 4 or 5 years, the structural deficit or the spending commitments that we are locked into as a government without any policy change are such that if commodity prices come off more than predicted, we could have deficits of $30, $40 billion year on year for the years, the 4th year and the 5th year and the 6th year. Now, if you look at what Treasury's done in the budget, they assumed that the terms of trade, which are still 15 points above the peak of the Howard years, 15 points. I mean, it went to 150-year highs, as you recall, 2010, 11, but it's fallen back 20 points, but still 15 points above the peak of the Howard. So it's still at a very healthy level, right? They've assumed it'll drop 1.75 and then basically flatline for the next several years. Now, I've been in commodities half my life. What goes up comes down, and it's not necessarily going to collapse. I certainly hope it won't collapse, but it's going to come down more than flatlining 15 points above where the Howard government enjoyed relatively high terms of trade. So if it does, if it even just gets down to 5 points above the Howard years, we have got deficits of $30 to $40 billion without policy change. So the scope, I've been in business, you know what it's like. Debt's a very important part of your armoury, but up to a certain level, above a certain level, debt starts to control you. So the capacity for, and it can happen very quickly, if you've made bad assumptions about revenue 3 or 4 years out, you can find yourself with the banks controlling you and the debt controlling you. The same for a country. And, you know, they talk about the rating agencies and all the rest. If our growth of debt continues to grow at a rate faster than it ever has in our history, and we're getting up, when you accumulate all of that debt and compare really apples with apples with a lot of other countries, we could well be to 40, 50, 60% if there's no policy change. That's my point. And so we are going to stop the debt. We're going to stop the growth of debt, but we still have to have infrastructure. And we have done a lot of work now with the infrastructure firms, with investment banks, with the super funds. How do we get super money into greenfields projects? We've found we have been talking to them for months. I have been, and some others. I think there are means, special purpose vehicles and other things that we've been that have been looked at by the sector, but we've gone in a lot further, I think, where you can change the risk and reward. The risk and reward that's facing a super fund and get them into greenfields. A lot of the opportunities, like Mike Baird did recently, where you can provide opportunities where someone's already got an existing asset and an income stream. You extend that income stream and use that revenue to build more infrastructure. It does push some of the costs of that new infrastructure out to a future generation, but in many respects that's where it should be, because they're the ones that are going to principally benefit from it, right? So there's lots of ways we have to, in many respects, reboot the mining boom. At the moment, you're hearing Bowen and Rudd all saying it's all over. The development stage, the construction phase of the mining boom is finished. Well, I was on the Gorgon gas project. I was worked with BHP and Rio. I did a lot of work with second-tier miners in Asia. I've got really good contacts. I've spent the last 9 months dropping in on Gladstone and all these other projects around the country. There are companies now that want to develop the greenfields of the last 4 years with brownfields developments now, more trains for gas, but they're finding it's dearer to put an extra train on a project in Gladstone or Barrow Island or wherever than it is to put a greenfields train in Canada, which is madness, right? I mean, we have priced ourselves out of it. A lot of it is the excessive regulation. The coal industry say that in 2007-8, it was taking them 12 months, under 12 months, to clear all regulations through to a approval process. It's now taking over 3 years. Same thing. That's tens of millions of dollars. That's making us uncompetitive. In fact, the big companies are saying, the big resource and energy companies are saying to me, the thing that is primarily making us so uncompetitive, as long as the dollar comes off a bit, which it's starting to, the thing that is really making us most is this extension of approval processes. And I could give you endless examples of just mind-boggling. The woman who employed me at the Gorgon gas project is now dealing with all the environmental approvals for a big Queensland gas project. She told me 2 months ago she employs 94 university-educated environmental specialists to assist her to meet all of the all of the approval processes. Olympic Dam failed because of the board had basically made a decision to go ahead. That's 80 years, 100 years prosperity for a whole state. Was killed by the state and federal obsession with more and more and more approval processes, in many cases far in excess of what all of our competitors have to face. So I think there's an enormous opportunity. One, if we aggressively challenge some of the cost fronts, get the carbon tax off, and all the regulations that go with that, the costs of that, but then bring back these approval processes from 3 years to 1 year or less. These sorts of things can put us back in the game, and there is another 150 billion pipeline. We won't get back to the dizzy heights of the boom, but this is a further bridge to take us while we try and breathe life back into the rest of the economy, and we need that sort of continued sustainable growth and development. So live within our means. Second thing, reverse the nanny state. The most important thing, I think we decided 3 years ago that we wouldn't have the money whenever we got to government. It's worse than we anticipated, but so it's even more important to try and do what we can very aggressively with removing regulation, right? We will look at moratoriums on any new regulations in certain key sectors. But not only that, we're looking to strip away so many of the things. We're looking to outsource, in a way, our federal environmental legislation or the implementation of it to the states. They'll act as our agent, so there'll be one body, one set of bureaucrats, one centre where all of the data will go to. I think that alone will, in some cases, will take a year off the approval processes, and a different mindset between the state bureaucrats and the federal in this regard. So we've worked very heavily on a lot of areas. That's where we've got to strip costs out of business and get things get things moving. The third thing is to restore a culture of personal responsibility. So things like the reintroduction of the ABCC, which did, when it was introduced, saw a $5 billion productivity gain per year in the construction sector. We can do it again. It's all back to where it was: the thuggery, the criminality, the involvement of the bikie gangs, particularly in Victoria and in Western Australia. We are going to require all the unionists, union officials, to be covered by the same governance requirements as directors. So instead of a $5,000 tap on the wrist for doing things such as snubbing their nose at a Supreme Court writ, where the rest of us would be in jail, they'll face potentially $250,000 fines and 5 years jail. Right now, that'll focus a lot of attention, I do think, in the years ahead, on the way in which they conduct themselves, and it should. Right. So, lots of other ways across many areas of policy. This notion of how do we restore a culture of personal responsibility, and finally, the fourth one: so live within our means, reverse the nanny state, restore a culture of personal responsibility, and back our strengths. And by strengths, I mean every business I've ever worked in, everyone from the receptionist to the CEO knows the 2 or 3 or 4 things that you just must never contradict. The 3 or 4 things that are the strengths of the business, what it's known for, things that you must nurture and foster and develop. And it is the strengths of the business. It's base, really. It's what you build lots of other things around it, but it is the inherent strength of any business or organisation. It's no different for a country. What has given us this quality of life that we enjoy? If everyone, not just the politicians, but importantly the politics, but if all the public servants, right down to the most junior person, and if the community really felt that resources and energy was one of our great strengths, you wouldn't put 2 new taxes and a whole raft of regulations on it in the middle of the biggest boom in decades, in 100 years. You wouldn't do it. If you really thought agriculture, it was a century of water and food security, and that agriculture had a very big part to play in our prosperity in the next 100 years, you wouldn't do what they did to the live cattle job. We had a problem to fix, but you wouldn't send an email, not even via the ambassador, to the government saying, by the way, 30% of all the protein that's currently imported into your country stops tomorrow morning indefinitely because of a TV program in Australia 2 nights ago. I mean, I've done a lot of work in Jakarta and other Asian countries. Just the humiliation after 100 years of colonisation. I tell you, you know what it's like. A lot of you would have worked in this. You only have to scratch a little bit. They feel patronised at the first. You've got to be very careful with these things. And so they should. There's thousands of years they've existed, many of those countries, and they see us as Johnny-come-latelys, connected to the West, and patronising and humiliating them. And we'll pay for that for a long time to come. We won't know about it, but we'll pay for it. Same thing with education. It's the second biggest export in New South Wales, the biggest export in Victoria. Enormous future in the region with the growth of the middle class. An unbelievable opportunities, not just bringing students here, but with all of the opportunities to. There'll be many different models with online and all the rest of it. But you wouldn't do what they did to the visas there. There's a bunch of young Indians in Melbourne who the High Commissioner of India said to me would have struggled to integrate well into Delhi, much less into Melbourne, right? Shonk had gone and got these young fellas out of the real back blocks, right? They had no social skills. They did the most unbelievable things in the main streets of the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. And, of course, they got into strife. Now, that one, out of 300,000 foreign students, that one problem led to changes to visa arrangements, which basically required everyone who wanted to come here to lodge all their tuition and their accommodation for 3 years in advance. And then 20% reduction the following year, and everyone's scratching their head wondering what happened. Now, again, if everyone knew that education was a great strength, you'd be doing everything possible to assist, and sure, you'd fix that problem, but you wouldn't blow up the whole scheme because of it. Same with, medical. Here's the government looking to take $400 million out of. We're one of we're as good as anybody and better than most in medical research. It's become a great strength of the country. Last budget, they were looking to take 400 million out of it. It's just, again, if you thought about our strengths, you wouldn't compromise them. You mightn't favour them. You certainly won't stand in their way. And, hospitality and tourism in that category. So they're the sorts of things which have shaped everyone who comes in. That little template's been put across it. I'll say, I'm sorry, but you just violated 3 of the 4 principles. Go back and reshape your policy. So the work we've done, not only in framing it, but also then how do we implement it? A lot of work done. We've had the same colleagues in their positions for the whole term, right? 16 of my colleagues were all ministers in the Howard government. On the other side, over 70 of the 102 have been ministers in the government. It's like pass the parcel, and they've had 4 higher education ministers in the last 5 months. They've had 6 small business ministers in the last 5 years. And they've, of course, had all the chaos and the division. So these are the sorts of things we have to highlight and contrast, because I think that's the basis on which people will make a considered judgment. Thanks very much.
Just interested in terms of schemes like the Tony's paid parental leave scheme, how that fits in with those 4 principles that you outlined.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. That policy has been core policy now for 4 years. You might recall it was, but it is, as we've been seeking to change. Some of our policy has been informed, if you like, by some of the work that's the Grattan and others who've shown that the most significant thing we could do from a productivity point of view in the short term as a government is to encourage an increase of seniors into the workforce. The second most important thing we can do as a government is to encourage women into the workforce. And there's probably another 10% who could go into the workforce than currently is the case. With seniors, there's again a bigger cultural problem where there has been this expectation created that you get to 55, 60 and you past your use-by date. And yet I'm starting to see a real revolution taking place in some of the light manufacturing areas around my electorate and others where, getting former tradesmen and women who at 50 can no longer crawl around the roof and be electricians or plumbers or even butchers who don't want to get up at 1:30 in the morning anymore, who are now starting to be retrained at 50 to manage large capital equipment where it was previously where there might have been 25 metal workers, there's now 3 metal workers, young people who are computer literate programming all the orders, and the rest of the place is now people over 50. And some of the managers say to me, we'll get 25 years potentially out of this workforce as long as we have the flexibility to, go for 2 months on a caravan trip in the 60s and all that sort of, to accommodate, there's expectations at that age but still stay in the workforce and to use the skills and to do some retraining. So it's against that background that you need to judge that policy. Thanks, Paul.
Paul Kelly from The Australian. How do you balance 2 economic objectives? On the one hand, you want to reduce the deficit and get back to a budget surplus. Yet on the other hand, we've got an economy where there are confidence and activity problems. And so therefore, you want to ensure that demand and activity is supported to a certain extent. So how do you balance those potentially competing objectives?
Okay. It's a good question. It just gets back to probably the root of what I've been seeking to get across today, and that is if philosophically you believe that that government is essential to drive demand in lean times, well, that's what you have to do. I mean, our view is if we can have a mindset towards business, almost like the Bunnings quote, right? We're not going to be beaten in helping business achieve deals and to make investments, right? So much has been done in the last 6 years, which has treated business as though it's out to rip off the system, rather than it is the generator of demand. It is you encourage investment, you generate demand and production through that. We want to displace big government with a fired up private sector. Now you do need a set of policies then that do that. It's not going to automatically happen. There is a lack of confidence. So if we do get the privilege of government, we're looking at what things can we do quickly, which will demonstrate that there's a new approach going to be taken, that we are going to focus primarily on growing the pie so that we've then got something to redistribute rather than the other way around. And a lot of it is, I went to Hong Kong before Christmas for a week to look at the possible pipeline opportunities. I met with the head of one of the biggest banks in Asia. He's a man from Beijing, done all the RMB work. Halfway through the meeting, there's only the two of us, he said, "Mr. Robb, could you please explain?" He said, "We put tens of billions of dollars into Australia. But in the last 5 years," he said, "could you explain what's happened? There's all these rules keep changing." And he said new taxes are coming in, and he basically didn't use this language, but he basically said the ROI for most of the projects that we had consummated before that, the ROI is tanked, right? And it was really a lecture dressed up as a question, but it was sovereign risk, right? And it's what I'd been hearing across every sector. It was what we've all been witness to. But here he was basically saying to me, you used to have a reputation as a country which was a stable place to do business, and that's gone. And then subsequent to that, we've had the thin capitalisation in this budget. It was just seen as a revenue measure, right? The MIT stuff, no consultation, no preparation, no argument. It was basically to fill holes that they created through overspending. And business, and no wonder confidence is down. The pharmacy big pharmacy companies had struck a deal 2.5 years ago, a 4-year deal. The ink was hardly dry, and the government broke it, right? Now there was $1 billion worth of R&D from the pharmaceutical companies in Australia. They told me a couple of months ago it's probably down now to about 800 million. People have got choices. These companies have got choices, and if they think this is a place which is sympathetic to investment and research and development and growth, they want to come and do business here. But they're all being discouraged. That's what I was saying about the brownfields projects. It's dearer than the greenfield projects in Canada. And yet there is a welter of, they've got projects here, they want to extend them, they want to extend it now because, say what you will, coal's going to keep increasing. It mightn't be keep increasing at the same rate it has been, but coal and gas, and we've got another 50 years of strong, not necessarily development, but production. But there's certainly another $150 billion worth of projects out there. And now all of these things are a product of government. A lot of it is government policy, which has created an environment which is anti-business, anti-investment. And if we can show that we have and we can put ourselves in the shoes of all these people who are trying to make investment decisions, including small business, then I think that we'll start to see the investment. Consumers will start to spend more and not save 10% of their disposable income. And we won't need government at the centre of things. We won't need that government spending.
Roger.
Andrew,
just
I'm not sure whether this is a...
I'm not sure whether this is a question or a plea, but
can I just start by saying what music, what you've said is to my ears, and I think everybody else here. My plea is around the Fair Work Commission, and whether the coalition could consider putting a productivity target on the Fair Work Commission's judgments, so that the aggregate of their outcomes in any year could be considered in the context of their impact on productivity.
That's a worthwhile thought. That I will take that on board and see what can be done there. Certainly, the whole issue of flexibility, and our priority will be in the first 12 months the ABCC and the requirement for union officials to meet the same standards, the governance standards as company directors. There's a number of changes that we announced that we will seek to make to flexibility arrangements within the Fair Work Act. We'll work within the Fair Work Act, and there'll be other measures we'll send to a productivity commission, but they would be a second term. They would go to the next election. But what you just suggested is something that could be done at any stage. So thanks. I'll have a look at that.